Now, a lot of people who have studied a lot of cultures, even older cultures, as far back as 15, 13 century, will tell you how people have traveled, have borrowed, have always been in contact with the other world. Maybe the Europeans, discovered those other places in whenever they discovered, which is 15, 14, whenever that was. But other people have been traveling back and forth. We have travelers, all over from the Arab world and Africa who traveled around, who went as far as China and many places. I mean, Marco Polo being one of them, earlier travelers. So people have been trading. Africans and China have been trading since forever, curated by the Arabs and Persians and Indians, And it makes sense because if you look at the map, it made sense that the Chinese always want the elephant tusk and rhino horns. It didn't start now. The link has always been there, and eventually they made the trip in the 15th century to come to Africa. So for me, I think we should stop obsessing about purity, because we will not find our answer there. I think we should look at originality, whatever instruments you put together, wherever you borrow from. And if you look at originality, how original in terms of what are you able to make from the ingredients, that you have at your fingertips. And I think if you look at it from that point of view, it is artistically viable to look at originality. If you think in that framework, Bach will be okay, Fela will be okay, because they are original, regardless of where they are borrowed from. They have made something artistically original, and that's fine. Now, moving on from there, for me, I think that Africans should be allowed to tell their stories, whichever way they want to tell the story. There are shades of Africanness and African stories, and I think it's fine. I think there is this, you could call it policing, monitoring, curating of African stories. And I think that, Africans should tell their stories however they want to tell it. Now, and one thing comes to my mind as I'm talking about that. There was this incident that happened among very senior scholars in the profession. So it's Kofi Agao Akiuba. Now this is Akiuba writing. Kofi Agao Akiuba Root Stones, and I think James Courtin, or is it Courtin? Sorry, I don't really know how to say that name. So James is an American ethnomusicologist, a non-African scholar of African music, while Agau obviously is an African. I think Agau wrote something in a journal, and as well as James Curtin and Ruth Stones made a comment that James's approach to African music was more sensitive to the nuances of African. So in other words, his approach was more African than Kofi Agawu's approach. And what Akiuba was trying to say in that article titled, "Not for Your Comfort," not N-O-T, but N-A-U-G-H-T, not for your comfort. So what he was trying to say was that it was not a good way for Ruth Stones to kind of tell any African scholar how to write about themselves, basically, and that there is no prescribed way of writing about African or Africanness, and that people can come from different ways. I think that sometimes we are tempted to get halfway into a conversation that is already going, instead of us getting to the bottom of the conversation and ask, why are we here in the first place? What I'm trying to get to is that even we as Africans, I think we kind of fall into the trap of thinking that there is one route to being an African or being African, whether it's skin color, culture, or anything. While I understand where it's coming from, I think it can be problematic a little bit, because there is no one route to Africanness or being an African or writing about or researching. I think there's so many ways, so many routes, so many shades of Africanness. I think the earlier we acknowledge that, the better for us. So linking that to that incident, what Akiuba was saying in that article was that Kofi Agawu had the right to write about African music from his point of view, and that should not be interfered with, and that to compare him with a non-African scholar of African music as that being more sensitive or basically better than, that one was uncalled for. The way we write about ourselves or represent ourselves, or write about our music or present our music is policed or is made to feel that they can only go through this way or that way. I mean, Akiyuba expressed his admiration for both scholars, but he said there was no need for that. And I think for me, this becomes important, that we don't kind of go back into this, this is African music, this can only be African, this is the only way African music is. That African music can be a lot of things, can come from a lot of places, from a lot of people. We must begin to see ourselves as diverse, even in our unity, but that we're diverse in terms of the shades of the skin color, the ideologies, the philosophies, and that's really what we are. Even if you look at the landscape, if you look at the continent in itself, we have Maghreb, the desert, you have the, what you refer to as the sub-Saharan, with different weather, sometimes it snows here in South Africa, where everybody thinks everywhere in Africa is just, hot and it's just a desert. We are really diverse. And so we shouldn't go back to that thinking that there's just one route to Africanness, to African music, to representation of Africa. So we shouldn't go halfway into the conversation. We must go to the roots of the conversation. And we must be able to express our Africanness from wherever we come from, the way we embody it, the way we are, from our experiences. For me, I think that is very important. Is the Babat that was introduced to the Chinese. Well, some form of Babat, but it goes from Babat to the Chinese, and then the Chinese now call it the pipa. Pipa. P means to play up or to play towards you. Pa means to play away from you or to play downwards. And the Chinese introduced it to the Japanese and is known as the biwa in Japan. The biwa, we have the pipa, the biwa, and that instrument, that short-necked, pear-shaped lute has just gone all around. That is, for me, the instrument that can characterize what you know as the Afro-Eurasia, landscape, in terms of the musical landscape, at least in what you call the global Middle Ages. It went all across, proliferated, all through from Central Asia, because also this takes us back to the civilizations, because, for example, Persia was like, the whole of that Central Asia. What that, Kazakhstan, this place, all the stands, is Uzbekistan, all of those places were part of, the Persian Empire, up until even northern Bactria, which is like southern India, So if you look at the old world, if I can say older world, even not just the, immediate old world, the way they were interconnected, it was amazing. And so that's why a lot of scholars have said it has to be renamed as the global Middle Ages, because it was global. Of course, not globalization as we know it today, but let's say early globalism. Like, that was in a way the first insights or glimpse into what a global world would be, because it was interconnected. It was really interconnected. And it makes sense if you look at the map. If you look at Africa, if you look at the Horn of Africa, Northeast Africa and all of that place, it's not difficult to just get into the Middle East. If you look at Africa on the other side, from North Africa, you can basically, the way you look at Robben Island, you could probably look at Spain from there. So it's not difficult for these things to have happened, for these interconnections to have happened at all. One of the benefits of musical instruments as a tool in navigating interconnectedness is that musical instrument most of the time retains some aspect of the early instrument. So most of the time, if they introduce the instruments to people, to new people, they will adopt some form of similar name or syllables. It could even be that people tried to call it that name, but they couldn't call it that name. But you begin to see, you say pipa, babat, biwa, you begin to see even in the language. Now we're going into language, but then we'll go back to music. You understand? The musical instrument, even when transformations are made to that musical instrument, you will still see resemblance. Europeans, when they came to the scene, they thought their own enlightenment was everybody's enlightenment, whereas there were other people who were already enlightened in terms of whatever we're talking about, in terms of where is it traveling, is it, seas and ships. I mean, for example, you were talking about looking to the east because of China. It is only because of that that we have revisited the fact that before the Europeans came to Africa, the Chinese came. In that century, early in the 15th century, there's a lot of documentation and scrolls and all of those things bearing that evidence when the Chinese navigated down, to Africa. And there is something important about that, which is that it is not usual for people to come to Africa and leave. The Chinese left. They came, they saw everything. They did not conquer. In fact, they came with gifts when they visited because of their own philosophy, which is they believe in what you call tribute-bearing system. It's a tributary system where they gain influence by kind of, being warm. And of course, they come with a big army and big ships to intimidate you in case you want to, you don't behave. But seldom did they use it. They used it in just one or two places during all their voyages. But usually they didn't. They came with gifts and all of that. And that made their hosts reciprocate. Hence, the giraffe was sent, to Peking, which was the capital then in China. There are animals that are not, indigenous to certain places in the world. So they had not seen that before. And the first one obviously came from Bengal in India, but obviously comes from Africa as a gift. And then the second one was sent when they realized that the Chinese emperor did fancy that gift. They felt that was a very kind gift. They associated all sort of mythical things with the giraffe because they thought it was what they call a shilin, but basically a unicorn. I think they mistook it for a sort of unicorn. And so they felt this was a sign coming from Africa, affirming the goodness and the greatness of the emperor and the peace, those type of thinking. So it made the relationship between Africa and China in that period kind of very good. They thought well of Africa. That gift was symbolic. But when they also came with gifts. And, very elaborate, and showered it on the African emissaries. And so those ambassadors also, they went to China. And this happened before the Europeans came to Africa. So now we are finding out about that. And so that changes a lot of the narrative that we've always had. And I'm of the opinion that when we begin to reconfigure, because also young scholars of today are saddled with the responsibility of redefining the field of African-related studies, be it in music, literature, anthropology, and all of those things. And I think that, I don't have the solution, but I think the conversation can start from beginning to gather multiple forms of evidence from different people that have interacted with Africa and have written about it and all of that as a basis for having multiple accounts to form an opinion, which is just the best thing to do. That is the right thing to do, to form a basis to look at the field. And there have been people who have been there. We have the Chinese, the Arab, the Persians, the Indians, and the Africans themselves. Then the European account will also be one of those accounts, not the account, because that is basically the lens through which we are seeing. Because most of the fields, we always have to read about Western scholars who have written about Africa. But what about other scholars? So if we really want to start, looking at redefining that beginning, that foundation, we have to look at multiple forms of evidence and accounts. Yeah.